So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has now been incorporated into Scots law following a unanimous vote in the Scottish Parliament. So what does it mean? What are the implications of this going to be? A crucial thing to understand here is that the actual text of the rights is pretty bland, and for almost every child in Scotland there's no chance that any of these rights are going to be infringed. They're not going to be tortured or sent to be a child soldier or whatever. But the important thing is it's not what's in the text of the rights. The important thing is that the Scottish law says that you interpret the rights in the same way that the United Nations does. And the way the United Nations does is it visits different countries and it tells them how they're doing with regards to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, UNCRC, and they give them a report. So if the United Nations says to a country, you need to do this to fulfill your responsibilities under the UNCRC, then under Scots law, then it really would seem that in Scotland it's illegal to not do that. You really have to do whatever the United Nations has recommended another country to do. So this is really profoundly anti-democratic. It's saying to the Scottish electorate, well, you can sort of push off because our law is going to be determined by the United Nations, what they've already said, and also by whatever they happen to say in the future. If somewhere down the line the United Nations visits Paraguay and says to Paraguay, you should do this. Okay, for Paraguay it's just advice, but for Scotland it becomes the law, because that's the way the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has to be interpreted in Scotland. And Scotland, as far as I can tell, is the only country in the world that's made the UNCRC part of its domestic law. So let's see what's in it. What has the United Nations said to other countries about the way it needs to implement children's rights? Well, you go through this list. Do you know what it sounds like? It sounds like a catalogue of SNP policies. And as I've said before, the SNP is never happier than when it's doing as it's told by the United Nations. But just listen to this lot. It's just like the SNP manifesto. Well, a few years ago, the United Nations visited Poland to tell them what they needed to do to improve their record on children's rights. Do you know what they told them to do? They said, amend the penal code to define hate speech and other hate crimes motivated by racism, xenophobia and homophobia. So they said to uphold children's rights you have to have hate crime and hate speech legislation, which of course is what the SNP want here. So according to Scots law now, you could argue that it would actually be illegal to not have hate speech and hate crime legislation. Now the bizarre thing here is that this bill going into Scottish law could be very reasonably interpreted as saying you have to have hate speech legislation. So the Conservatives vote against hate speech legislation, then vote for a bill that implies that it could very well be illegal to not have hate speech legislation. Get your head around that. The Conservatives clearly haven't. Right, what else have they told countries that they need to do? Conduct consultations with children on the voting age. Scotland, they've already been doing it. We've already gone down to 16. But the UN says conduct consultations with children about it. So, go to 12-year-olds. Do you think you should have the vote? Oh yes, I think we should. How about 10-year-olds? How about 8-year-olds? The government's got to consult. Now, if the United Nations is saying you have to consult, but is it okay for governments to say, yeah, we consulted, they said they wanted the vote, but we said no? You can see which direction it's pushing, isn't it? It's going down and down. It's this philosophy that you've got to achieve equality between children and adults. So they've got to be treated identically, basically in every way possible, which is madness, but that's the way the UN is pushing. Right, what else have the UN said to other countries? They've said there's been concern about the negative effect of high-cost childcare on children and their family environment. So you've got to provide more free and subsidised childcare. Exactly in tune with the SNP's philosophy. That's exactly what the SNP is doing. So they always start from the assumption that families, mothers in particular, are just desperate to get away from their own children and get to work, rather than thinking, actually, how can we help mothers to spend more time with their own children if that's what they want to do? The assumption is the way you help families is to enable both parents to be at work. Right, education. What's the UN had to say about education to other countries with regard to children's rights? Use the disciplinary measure of permanent or temporary exclusion, so in other words suspension or expulsion, as a means of last resort only, and further reduce the number of exclusions by working closely with social workers and educational psychologists in school and using mediation and restorative justice. Okay, so when, say, some 15-year-old boy has been and punched the headmaster and called him an effing who knows what in front of the whole school, then do everything you can to avoid actually having to expel him. Get the social workers in, get the psychologists in. Restorative justice, we talked about this. This is the idea that you don't have punishments. Instead, you have sort of mini counselling sessions, and that's all you need. You don't really need punishments. So basically, the UN is undermining discipline in schools. I mean, they're pushing at an open door in Scotland. So what the SNP does is exactly what the UN is telling it to do. Right, let's say a child does get expelled after, stabbing a teacher or, kicking another pupil one too many times or whatever. What does the UN say then? Ensure that children have the right to appeal against their exclusion and are provided with legal advice, assistance, where appropriate, representation for those with that means. So if the staff have seen the violent, aggressive behaviour repeatedly from a pupil, and eventually the school says, no, that's it, they're going to be expelled, this would apply to independent schools as well, then there has to be an appeal process that brings in lawyers. Massive expense, taking ages. What will schools think? They'll think, just can't be bothered with that. We're just going to have to put up with this pupil after all. I heard a story from a teacher in a school in Edinburgh quite recently where they had a pupil who was an absolute total nightmare, destroying the education of dozens of other children. But they're trying to get rid of him, trying to expel him, but they can't. The lawyers are involved, the human rights have come in, and he just carries on behaving appallingly and, destroying the education of dozens of other children. But remember, that's what has to happen because children's rights. I think those last two, they were in the report to the United Kingdom, by the way. They're what they've told us to do. Right, next one. Last time they came to inspect the United Kingdom, they said in Northern Ireland they need to actively promote a fully integrated education system. And they were quite explicit what they meant by that. They meant do away with Catholic schools. So if that's the way the UN interpret children's rights, that's the way it should be interpreted in Scots law. So if someone wanted to make a case the Catholic schools are actually illegal in Scotland because they infringe children's rights to non-discrimination or whatever, and they could say, look at the precedent, look at how the United Nations interprets these rights, I think they'd have a pretty strong case for saying that Catholic schools are now against the law in Scotland. And every single MSP has voted for this. Have they thought it through? Do they realise the implications? No. I don't think anyone in the Parliament has begun to think this through. Right, here's another one. Again, for the United Nations, this is what they said about Scotland. Children do not have the right to withdraw from collective worship without parental permission, and basically you need to sort this out, Scotland. So at any age, children should be able to overrule their parents. So if mum and dad say, yeah, that's quite nice, I want my children, my 8-year-old, I want them to go to the religious service in the school. But the child says, no, I don't want to go. Then the child can overrule the parents. They can't quite at the moment, they can when they're a bit older maybe, but the United Nations says the child has to be able to overrule the parents, and the MSPs have all signed up for this. So we're just waiting for the court case to come up, and when it does come up, you can expect that that's what's going to happen. Another thing the United Nations says, it says to some countries, children's views are not systematically heard in policy making on issues that affect them. So in Scotland you get this ridiculous children's parliament and children's cabinet meeting with Nicola Sturgeon, when a few hand-picked and carefully trained children are put in to discuss things with John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon, and you'll never guess what the children say. The children say exactly what the UN and the SNP would like them to say. Then they call that listening to children. They call it systematically listening to children. And it's a complete facade. But this is all part of the United Nations Convention of Human Rights setup. Right, what else do the UN say you have to do with regard to these rights? Well, they also say you have to have a smacking ban. You have to. If you haven't got a smacking ban, you're not protecting the rights of children. Their rights are being infringed. So, again, let's go back to our friends, the Conservatives. The Conservatives vote against the smacking ban in the Scottish Parliament. They say, no, we don't want a smacking ban. But then they sign Scotland up to make the UNCRC part of Scots law, as the UN interprets it, and the UN interprets it as saying you have to have a smacking ban. So effectively, the Conservatives have both voted against and for a smacking ban. I guess it's like no one understands. No one has thought these things through at all. Right, sex education. That's been a big issue for us. We've focused on that a lot. The sort of sex education that's been implemented in Scotland. Okay, the particular crudities and vulgarities of the Scottish version are unique to Scotland, but the general picture of the too much, too young, wrong message, that's worldwide, and it's pushed by the UN. And they push it on countries under the banner of children's rights. So in other words, if you don't have really inappropriate, age inappropriate, permissive sex education, then you're not upholding children's rights. That's what the UN say. And Scotland has now made this law. So the Conservative Party, I mean, you really do despair, don't you? They're so busy telling the SNP that they're obsessed with independence that they don't think things through that come up before them. It is staggering that these issues I've raised here just seem to have passed the Scottish Parliament by completely. So 3 problems with putting the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. Number 1, it's anti-democratic. It's saying to the Scottish voters, we don't care what you think, we care what the UN thinks. Not just what they think now, whatever they might decide in the future as well. What they decide, that becomes how Scots law is interpreted. Effectively becomes the law in Scotland. Problem number 2, the UN is not neutral. They've obviously and openly got a progressive, liberal, secular agenda that they push around the world very, very strongly. And they'll be able to push it in Scotland more strongly than anywhere else in the world because Scotland has incorporated the UNCRC into Scots law. Number 3, not a single MSP has shown any understanding of the serious issues at stake here. So with a lot of things now, SNP policy, it's not just the law, it's like doubly the law, because they passed another law that says it would be illegal, for example, to not have a smacking ban or to not have hate speech legislation. I mean, it really is a bizarre situation. But just one thing to finish, this is on a slightly different tack. Let's look at this quite briefly. Remember the name person scheme or the controversy? This was the SNP seeking to intervene in family life to an unprecedented extent, to undermine parental authority and autonomy. And there was outcry about it, and eventually was struck down by the Supreme Court. Right, introduced in the UNCRC, this is named person 2.0. Only there's one big difference. It's got different clothes on, and it's got the support of all the parties. I'm not aware of any organisation opposing it. I'm not aware of even any individual outside the Scottish Family Party who's been raising concerns about it. But I'm just going to read you a section from a textbook here. This is a standard Oxford University Press human rights textbook on the section about children, human rights advocacy. And what I'm reading here, it's not from some little box at the side where it's got like some wacky people think this. This is just from the main text of it. So what does it say about the children's rights movement? The ultimate rationale for children's rights lies in the problematizing of parental moral agency. In other words, it's all about undermining the rights of parents. As Geraldine Van Buren observes, the convention challenges the concept that family life is always in the best interest of the child and that parents are always capable of deciding what's in the best interests of children. In other words, children's rights advocacy undermines the right of parents to make decisions for their children. Is that the picture in Scotland? Is that the way we're heading? Is that what the named person scheme was all about? Of course. Children's rights effectively empower officials in relation to parents rather than empowering children. Yeah, empowering officials in relation to parents. That sound like the named person scheme? That sound familiar? Yes. Only this time there's no opposition because it's called children's rights instead. As such, children's rights advocacy, while often characterised as comparable to earlier civil rights movements, departs from the beliefs of these struggles. While classic civil liberties essentially embody freedoms from state interference, the expanding children's rights framework represents a trend towards external governance of interpersonal relations. In other words, the government interfering more within family relationships, within family life. How clear can it be? Accordingly, children's rights advocacy is sceptical about the autonomy of the private sphere associated with classic civil liberties. So children's rights advocacy is not so happy with families dealing with their own affairs. The state needs to be involved as well, just to make sure they're doing it right. Sound familiar? Sound like the named person scheme? Yeah? Critics warn children's rights advocacy is empowering the state to discipline ordinary people for departing from preferred professional parenting norms. Named person scheme? Exactly. In other words, if you're not bringing up your kids just the way the government wants you to, then they'll intervene and sort things out for the good of the children, of course, because the children have got rights. They've got the right to be brought up exactly the way the government wants them to be brought up. And it risks giving a license to repressive state powers and undermining human rights. Repressive state powers, remember the statement from the Supreme Court about the named person scheme? I mean, it really does make you wonder, doesn't it? When the SNP tries something called named person scheme, and it gets shot down in flames, so they just rename it something else, and suddenly there's no opposition to it, everyone's slapping each other on the back about it, and it's proceeding unopposed. So that's the state of play in Scotland at the moment. Constitutional obsession means that people have got no energy left to actually look at these vital areas that are really fundamental to shaping the future of Scotland. Partly it's they're too busy, they're obsessed with other things, partly it's just they're not in tune with what's going on. They haven't got the insight to appreciate the changes that are taking place. So if you want to change that, if you want to put in some real resistance to these moves, you need to support the Scottish Family Party. And you can join us via the link below. Thanks for watching.